Hey everyone, and welcome back to our course on online academic presenting. As you'll recall, our last discussion centered around understanding your audience. Today, we're going to shift to focus to something I think is equally crucial: how to structure and pace your presentation. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a long one, so let's dive in. Every scientific discovery, every research has a story to tell. That brings us to the importance of storytelling in science. Now, our goal is to make presentations not just informative, but also memorable. And we're going to go over some storytelling techniques here that you can incorporate into your presentations. Now, when you start to set up your presentation, first you have to ask yourself if there are any constraints to work with. This is something that we talked about previously in the context of your presentation. Are there any constraints? Are there any time limits? Some platform limitations maybe? All the different rules you'll have to play by before you can actually start working on your PowerPoint slides. Jot these down into a notebook app and have them ready on the side for you to really start digging into the structure. First, we're going to just have a little bit of a brainstorm using the 3X structure. The 3X structure, it's a class of narrative framework that's used in a lot of different forms of storytelling. Basically, it divides the story into 3 distinct sections. You might know them as beginning, middle, and end. Only here we refer to them as the 3 acts: setup, conflict, and resolution. Let's see how we can apply them in a more scientific context. You can see these set up as an explaining of what the problem really is that you're trying to fix. It's an analog for the introduction of your scientific paper. The conflict, on the other hand, is something you can explain as how you are going to close that gap in knowledge. Like, what are you doing to study and understand the problem that you were going to fix? This can include elements from your study design, but also materials and methods. And finally, we have the resolution. What did you learn? This is where you draw parts of your results, but also the conclusions of your research, which is equally important. This means we have a really good base for our story, but of course, we need to start our presentation somehow first. And for that, we will create a hook, something to grab your audience and reel in their attention. Now, let's run through all these different steps that I just explained to you, but with a little bit more focus of what that means for your research and your presentation. How do you apply this? What we saw from doing the research ourselves was that every great presentation really begins with a compelling hook. You know, that statement or a question that just immediately grabs your audience attention. However, something important is that your hook doesn't need to be just over the top or dramatic. That might be true for YouTube or social media, but we're here in an academic setting after all. Here, it's more of an entry point that connects directly to the core of your research. The way that we like to think about this is with the problem, gap, hook approach. It begins by explaining the problem you want to address, and then you continue into the knowledge gap that you intend to close. And finally, you finish off with a really good statement to hook your audience attention. For instance, this is something that came from my own master thesis. Before dredging companies can start working, they need to know if there is any marine wildlife in the area. This is very expensive and time-consuming. But did you know that you can actually study whales from space at a fraction of the cost? Something like this, it really helps to set the stage for what's to come, but also makes it really enjoyable to listen to for your audience. Now that we have the hook ready, it's time to think about the setup of the problem you're trying to fix. This is also the part where you provide the context. Why is this a problem? Why is it so significant? And who does it affect? And what are the broader implications if you don't figure it out eventually? If you can paint a really clear picture of the problem, you're setting yourself up for a natural transition to introduce your research as a solution, or maybe just as an exploration into these issues. That was the first act. Now we can continue with the second act. the conflict or the transformation phase. This is where you can use all the materials and the methods that you use, the challenges that you faced, and how you went through that transformation process. It's not just about the what, but also the how. So if you can share these parts of your journey, you really allow your audience to experience it with you. And that can make your findings really impactful. It's about sharing the little issues you faced, some obstacles you had to overcome, maybe some moments you felt stuck with experiments. If you can add these little elements to your presentation, it will just make it more human to listen to. Now that we've built up all of that, it's time to go into Act 3. And this is where all that anticipation is going to build up. This is where you introduce your findings. It's the resolution. What have you learned throughout your research? Really important here is that clarity is key. You have to use your visuals, your data, all of your graphs in a really concise way to make sure that they understand what your results actually are. It also should provide an answer to those problems you set up at the beginning in Act 1. We're almost there because there's still one last thing to do. It's properly ending the presentation. Now, instead of that awkward thank you slide where the audience is waiting to give an applause, consider ending with that thought out call to action. It might be a question or a glimpse into the future of your research, but it's the thing that we discussed about in the previous lesson. You could also just use a lighthearted joke because now your audience knows you a little bit better, or share a very important statement that you want to make. Why this is so important is that your start and ending should leave a lasting impression. Make sure that your message resonates with your audience long after the presentation is finished. Now we've come to the second part of a good presentation. That's pacing. Prepping your presentation is always a dance between engagement but also education. It's a balancing act of making sure your audience actually is listening to you, but also understanding what the information is that you're sharing. So just as a well-paced movie keeps you from wanting more, you can make your audience more receptive and retain more of what you're sharing. Problem is, if you go too deep, too long, your listeners might just get lost in the details. But on the other hand, if you remain fluffy and on the surface, they might miss the point of your insights. Luckily, there is an analogy for about anything. And in this case, it is the deep dive analogy. The ocean represents the entire scope of knowledge that we have, while the surface is the space where everybody feels comfortable. The air is easy to breathe. You, as a presenter, your job is to guide your audience through all these different layers of information. Now, before you begin your dive, you need to establish a common ground where everybody feels comfortable. That's also why it was so important to know who sits in front of you. The start might be a fact that everybody knows, some relatable story, or maybe just a general overview. But now that you've set the stage, it's actually allowing you to go a little bit deeper into specifics. You can warn your audience that you're going deeper with statements like, hey, I'm going to go a little in detail now, or it's going to get a little bit technical. This gives your audience a heads up, and it also mentally prepares them to the influx of new details. This is a re-engagement technique to shake your audience awake after a long chunk of information. Now, while you're in that technical section, it's really good to use some visual tools to really illustrate your points and to avoid jargon unless it's really needed. But if you do use technical terms, also make sure to explain them in a simple language that just everybody can understand. You want the attention for the next part of your presentation. As a diver myself, I know you cannot stay at depth forever, and at some points you need to resurface. Just let everybody catch a breath. You can use phrases like, hey, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Or, now, what does this mean for? To guide your audience back and actually contextualize all the details you've been talking about them at the depths. That's basically it, and you can just rinse and repeat this process and play with the depth throughout your entire presentation. This is something that we're also working on in the workbook, or maybe take out a notebook for now and just plan both the structure and the pacing of your presentation. It allows you to get in that helicopter view where you can see what's missing or maybe what you need to cut entirely. Now, depending on the constraints we talked at the start, this is also the place where you can think of how many slides do I need per minute? Where are I going to place these deep dives and surface points? A general tip we can give you here is to switch between the depths and surfaces every 5 to 7 minutes for like real engagement with your audience. Now, every presentation has a unique message, but there are a few structures that just have stood the test of time. We already saw the 3x structure, but in the workbook of this course, you can find some other examples that you can follow. Most of them still relying on the 3x structure in one way or another, but it's maybe good to just try and test if one of those works for you. Try and see if you can plan your presentation like we explained here. And in the next lesson, we'll dive into the actual design of your presentation. We'll see you there.